From threats of annihilation to talk of a peace deal after 7 decades of conflict, can Koreans look forward to a unified country? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is a possible end to the Korean War. Well, there have been threats from Pyongyang for decades, but almost overnight, there appeared to be a complete about-face, with North Korea's leaders saying he's not the kind of person who will use nuclear weapons against the South or the United States. At a historic meeting on Friday, the North and South committed to a new era of peace on the Korean peninsula. Now, Kim Jong-un even invited journalists and foreign experts to witness the closing of his nuclear facilities. But critics say it's all just too good to be true. Why would the North Korean leader have a sudden change of heart? Randolph Nogel reports.
수시로 만나서 걸린 문제를 풀어나가고 마음을 합치고 의지를 모아서 그런 예지를 가지고 나가면 우리가 잃어버린 11년이 아깝지 않게 우리가 좋게 나가지 않겠나 이런 생각도 하면서 정말 만감이 교차하는 속에서 이제 한 200m를 걸어왔습니다.
우리 김정은 위원장이 사상 최초로 군사 분계선을 넘어오는 순간 이 판문점은 분단의 상징이 아니라
A moment emblazoned in time, one that could mark the start of a new peace between the two Koreas. Both leaders have proposed a treaty to end the nearly 68-year-old conflict, along with the establishment of a nuclear-free Korea. Now, incremental steps are being taken to move towards those ambitious goals. South Korea says it will remove its loudspeakers, positioned on the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. These blasted news, pop music, and propaganda across the border. Seoul switched them off as a goodwill gesture ahead of last week's summit. And Pyongyang says it will set its clocks back 30 minutes to match the South's time zone. The summit, with all its pomp and circumstance, has given many South Koreans a feeling of optimism. Polling shows nearly 2/3 say they trust Kim Jong-un's promises. But Western officials are perhaps more cautious than optimistic.
Until we see concrete changes in North Korea's actions, we must continue to put pressure on North Korea and to continue with the sanctions.
So we're going to have hopefully a very successful negotiation over the next 3 or 4 weeks. Let's see how it goes. I think we'll do fine. I think we're going to do just fine. Now, they were saying, what do you think President Trump had to do with it? I'll tell you what. Like, how about everything?
The next step will be a meeting between President Trump and North Korea's leader. Kim Jong-un has already met U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Pompeo says he told Kim the U.S. will demand irreversible steps towards shutting down North Korea's nuclear program. The prospect of that happening is now under the spotlight.
We'll want to test North Korea in this first meeting for evidence that they have made that strategic decision. There's nobody in the Trump administration starry-eyed about what may happen here.
A proposed peace plan isn't anything new. Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, hosted summits in Pyongyang in 2000 and 2007. The latter yielded an agreement to seek an end to the war, but North Korea continued to press on with its nuclear program. And with that program now more developed, Kim Jong-un may feel he has significant negotiating power. With the stated aim of denuclearization, the onus will now be on the two Koreas, along with the US and China, to secure a lasting peace after generations of war. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our guest now. Joining us from Augusta, Virginia, is Han Park. He is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Global Issues. From Medford, Massachusetts, is Sun-Young Lee. He is the Kim Korea Foundation Professor in Korean Studies at Tufts University. And in Washington, Robert Manning, a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Thanks all so much for joining us. Sun Young Lee, let me start with you. You agree with those who say this is all just too good to be true. Only Kim Jong-un can really win. How so?
Well, if I'd not seen this movie play out before, at least 3 times in the past, I may be less skeptical and more optimistic. The theatrics, the optics were gripping, the 2 leaders of the 2 Korean states shaking hands, walking hand in hand, side by side, affectionately, to and fro across the border. All that is very good, and all the positive pronouncements are very reassuring, if not for the fact that they're nothing new. We have heard it before: end the Korean War, no more war in the Korean Peninsula, peace park along the DMZ, peace maritime zone, complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Why would North Korea, after that banner ballistic year in 2017, all of a sudden change its tune from molto agitato to placido and agree to completely give up its nuclear weapons? It's obviously another phase, another round in North Korea's decades-old strategy.
Okay, Han Park, are you on the same page, or do you think we should celebrate these dramatic steps?
I think we should celebrate, but with reservations. The present situation is different from any time in the past. 2007, they produced a similar agreement, even more progressive agreement, even suggesting that we will overcome, transcend ideological and system differences. That wasn't the case this time around. But now there are a couple of things greatly changed. One is North Korea has decided officially to shift the emphasis from security to economic development. Kim Jong-un, if he cannot produce economic prosperity, his regime legitimacy is at danger. So that's one big change. And second change is we have a big shift in Washington. So Donald Trump, no one knows sure, but he is a very ambitious person, and he would like to mark a historical achievement.
Okay.
So these things are different variables that we face today that we haven't had in the past.
Okay. Robert Manning, do you feel good about this going forward, or do you think Kim Jong-un just has too much to win and Trump ultimately could stand to lose here?
I think it could get ugly fairly quickly, but let me step back a minute and ask the question, why is this happening now? And I think it's happening now, as the other gentleman said, there's some new circumstances. First of all, you have unprecedented economic sanctions squeezing the North Korean economy, running out of cash, causing internal problems. Number one. Number two, I don't think the North Koreans ever thought that China would enforce sanctions to the degree they are. And number three, I think that Kim is terrified of Trump's military threats and is worried that he might actually do something. On the other side, on the North Korean side, what's new is after 6 nuclear tests and almost twice a week missile tests for the past couple of years, Kim feels more confident that he has a strategic deterrent, and he's approaching these talks with that sort of confidence. You saw it in Seoul in the DMZ talks. You've seen it in his comments, his offers, and again, the offers he's put on the table are much less than they appear to be. For example, Kim said he's completed his nuclear program, so the idea of not doing any more testing because he didn't need to, not because he's doing us a favor. Number two, the nuclear test site is about to collapse on itself. There was a study last week by Chinese seismologists that suggests maybe if they did one more test, the whole thing would cave in.
Right.
And so he's making a virtue of necessity. I think it's brilliant diplomacy. And I think the U.S. is kind of caught flat-footed on this because it's not clear what our response is. And the response so far, yeah.
I mean, let me ask Sun Young Lee about that, particularly about this report that this nuclear site is about to fully collapse. I mean, does that leave North Korea negotiating here from an actual position of weakness, but a perceived position of strength internationally, which is what Kim Jong-un effectively wants?
It seems to me it's all about the optics. North Korea doesn't need to conduct a 7th or 8th underground nuclear test. It does, however, need to one day conduct a nuclear test, the hydrogen bomb test, in the Earth's atmosphere in outer space, as the US and the former Soviet Union used to quite routinely in the late 50s and early 60s, to make the point that North Korea has the capability to marry a very powerful nuclear warhead to an ICBM with which it can nuke any major city in the United States. Why is this happening right now? Well, I'm not convinced that Trump's fiery rhetoric really compelled Kim Jong-un to change, because fire and fury, that threat came in August 8th last year. 3 weeks later, Kim Jong-un fired a missile over Japan, and then 5 days later, on September 3rd, conducted a very powerful hydrogen bomb test. Total destruction, Rocket Man. Those comments came at the UN General Assembly, September 19th. 2 months later, Kim Jong-un fired the most powerful ICBM to date for his nation. So that behavior doesn't strike me as the behavior of a frightened man. Rather, he's been planning for all this all along.
Help me understand here. When you talk about the optics, because what's very important for the North Korean leader is how this plays out at home. I mean, it seems like he has existed because of his enemies. He has had North Korea under this constant threat that he has to protect the North Korean people from enemies that are surrounding them, threatening them, be it Japan, be it the United States, be it South Korea. For him to go out in front of the entire world and the North Korean people and suddenly shake hands and make friends with the very enemies that he was there to protect the North Korean people from, I don't understand how that plays out well optically for him in North Korea.
When his father, Kim Jong-il, received the South Korean president in Pyongyang in 2000, and then his predecessor in 2007, or when the grandfather received various foreign visitors from America, officials, journalists, and academics in the 70s, they made the point that these are tributary missions. These people are coming to recognize the great leadership of the great leader and so forth. So not only is the regime not really accountable to public opinion at home, they have a way of sort of spinning, putting a positive spin on this outreach program. Trump really needs to ask himself a basic question. At what point between February 9th and March 8th did Kim Jong-un's intentions go from insincere, a charade, to genuine? February 9th is when Mike Pence invalidated North Korea's outreach to South Korea, calling it a ploy, a charade.
Okay.
And March 8th is when Trump impulsively agreed to Kim Jong-un's proposition for a summit.
Okay, and then I'd like to ask Han Park a similar question then. I mean, how can Kim Jong-un go from being a man holding hands with Moon Jae-in, racked with emotion, this sensitive soul who celebrates one people, when just months before he was talking about the annihilation of the United States? Who is he?
Any country, any system will have different objectives of policy over time. North Korea has shown different objectives. 1, regime formation; 2, security; 3, now economic prosperity. So these things will occur at different points in time in countries' evolution. North Korea right now at a stage where they must induce economic growth, for which the security kind of policy in the past will not work, would not have worked. But now they have tested on 6 occasions the nuclear bombs and multiple times missile tests. Now they declared that this domestic audience, that they accomplished the security, they accomplished the regime formation. Now it's time to move to economic prosperity.
Okay.
So this is part of the beginning of the economic prosperity policy.
Okay, Robert Manning, briefly, if you can, I need you to comment
Yeah.
on who you think these dual personas of Kim Jong-un actually are. And then I'd like to go on to issues that the piece discussed. Go ahead.
I think there is a bit of something new going on. Don't forget, he's only 34 years old. He's thinking, I want to be around for a few decades. And the fact that they published a declaration in the North Korean press, they referred to Moon as president of South Korea, which they've never recognized. I think there's some interesting straws in the wind. What they mean, we don't know yet. But I think people have really underestimated Kim Jong-un as a very clever politician and diplomat.
Okay. Robert, I'll stay with you for a minute because I want to move on to one of the pillars of this meeting on Friday and what was revealed, and that was the agreement to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. But how do we define denuclearize? Let me ask you point blank, how does North Korea define denuclearize? What do they want to see specifically?
Well, in the past, when they use the term denuclearize, they mean after the U.S. Removes its strategic forces from the Korean Peninsula, ends the alliance, ends the nuclear umbrella over South Korea, then they'll denuclearize. That's pretty much how they've defined it in the past. Whether there's something new going on or not, we don't know. The closest we've got to defining it was the 2005 joint statement where the North Koreans for the first time told us exactly what they want. Energy aid, economic assistance, U.S. normalization, security guarantees, and a peace treaty. But that treaty fell apart because they refused the transparency requirements of verification.
Okay.
So it's not clear what they mean by denuclearization, and frankly, the only way we can find out is by testing them.
Okay. Han Park, do you think you know what North Korea means? And will they eventually insist that the almost 30,000 U.S. troops or so that are in South Korea leave the region?
Kim Jong-un in North Korea may be weird, but they are not unconventional. They are like any other country. They are like any other leadership. Now they want economic growth, for which they must have diplomatic normalization with the United States and South Korea and so forth. That's what they're doing. And the fact that they seemingly are interested in denuclearization suggests that this country should be viewed as a normal country. The IAEA should be involved and may be involved in verification, in counting the number of weapons and so forth. But North Korea is going to be and has to be subjected to IAEA's inspection, the general inspection, not the special inspection.
Okay. Sun Young Lee, I mean, we've heard some of the perspective on what perhaps the North is expecting here. I'd like you to speak from the U.S. perspective if you can. What will the U.S. be willing to do militarily, in a sense, to reach an agreement with North Korea?
North Korea seeks a denuclearization negotiation process, not actually a resolution. And this is no secret. When North Korea speaks of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which is a strange phrase when you think about the fact that there are no nukes in South Korea, North Korea doesn't say denuclearization of North Korea. This phrase made its debut in the September 19, 2005 joint statement out of the six-party talks. It was an unnecessary concession, and American policymakers blithely repeat that formulation, and North Korea frankly tells you what they mean by it. As Mr. Manning said, dislodging the U.S. nuclear extended deterrence from the region, the abrogation of the U.S.-South Korea Treaty, and the eviction of all U.S. troops from South Korea. That is exactly why Kim Jong-un is saying now, as did his grandfather and father, that, oh, I understand that the U.S. troops in South Korea play a constructive, stabilizing role, so I'm in no rush. I'm not calling for their immediate withdrawal. And then the outsider is dazzled by the North Korean dictator's reasonable line of thinking and comes away convinced that he has gained some great insight into the nature of the regime, mostly by virtue of his own charisma and empathy. And that is exactly what I see happening with respect to President Trump, who, moved by hubris and underestimation of the so-called rocket man in Pyongyang, will meet with Kim, hear pleasing things, and then come away ready to make more concessions, prematurely relaxing sanctions, and basically giving North Korea whatever it wants, as George W. Bush, whom we remember, who was no ardent admirer of the Kim regime, but did just that in 2006 in the wake of North Korea's nuclear tests.
Okay, let me just wrap up here with Robert Manning. I mean, you've heard what Song Yun-Lee thinks Trump can do going forward. Do you have a little more confidence then in that he is the president to kind of lead this peace process forward?
Well, the first thing I have to say is everything that's been going on has turned diplomacy on its head. These summits usually happen at the culmination of a process, not at the beginning. I don't think President Trump is planning on giving away the store to North Korea. I fear the opposite, that they're going to demand North Korea give up their nukes before we do anything, and that's equally unreasonable and will not happen, and then we'll be back to the kind of standoff we were before all this parade of peace began. So that's my concern.
Okay.
When NSC advisor Bolton goes on television and talks about a Libya model, what's the message to North Korea? Gaddafi gave up his nukes and he was overthrown. So that's exactly the opposite type of message they should be hearing from us.
Okay, Robert Manning, we're going to have to leave it there with your thoughts. I'd like to thank you all three so much for joining us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Still to come, strikes on an Iranian base in Syria. The regime says it's a new aggression. We debate whether Israel is responsible. Well, speculation has run wild over a series of missile strikes on 2 military facilities in Syria that have killed around 30 people. Most of those who've died are reported to be Iranian. And while no one has claimed responsibility for the strikes, many suspect it's Israel. Tension between the two regional rivals has been skyrocketing in recent weeks. Could they be using Syria as a chessboard? Shoaib Hassan has more.
It's the latest chapter in one of the most complicated conflicts in the world. A bombing of a Syrian army base being used by pro-regime Iranian forces. The suspicion is that it's being carried out by Israeli jets. Possibly the latest offensive by Israel in its efforts against Iran in Syria.
אני הוספתי שהמדיניות הזאת צריכה לבוא לידי ביטוי גם במדינת יכולות גרעיניות של מדינות טרור וגופי טרור. וחזרתי ואמרתי שהגורם שמערער את המזרח התיכון יותר מכל הוא איראן, ושעל הנשיא אסד להבין שכשהוא מאפשר התבססות צבאית של איראן ושלוחותיה בסוריה, הוא מסכן את סוריה, הוא גם מסכן את יציבות האזור כולו.
The Syrian regime confirmed a bombing took place at what it called a storage facility, but Iranian state media has denied the presence of Iran's forces in the vicinity. That's in line with Tehran's policy of official silence about its soldiers now entrenched across Syria. They've been pivotal in turning the tide against the opposition. But Israel says the forces, especially the elite Iranian Revolutionary Guards, are increasingly turning their crosshairs on the state of Israel. Israel says its actions are purely defensive, such as this recent air raid on an airbase in Homs that killed 7 senior Iranian commanders.
This deliberate killing that took place, Iran must take the right stand and decision to prevent Israel from setting rules that limit Iran's movement in Syria based on an agreement between Iran and Syria. Therefore, we expect something.
Tehran only admitted that a couple of its fighters were killed. Iran was also silent when Israel shot down a suspected Iranian drone over its territory. That may have less to do with the threat it feels from Israel, and more with Israel's greatest ally, the United States.
Iran destabilizes this entire region. It supports proxy militias and terrorist groups. It is an arms dealer to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and Iran conducts cyber hacking campaigns. And it supports the murderous Assad regime as well. Unlike the prior administration, we will not neglect the vast scope of Iran's terrorism. It is indeed the greatest sponsor of terrorism in the world, and we are determined to make sure it never possesses a nuclear weapon. The Iran deal in its current form does not provide that assurance.
It's that kind of sentiment from the US administration that's likely of more concern to Tehran than any immediate Israeli retaliation. Experts agree its peace deal with the West holds the key to Iran's increasingly precarious socio-economic situation. It's fueled the recent protests in the country and kept Iran's powerful hardliners in check. But that could change, especially with the growing Russian support against any aerial attack.
Mr. Secretary, do you have concerns that Russia is thinking about providing the S-300 missile system to the Syrian regime?
I think anything that's done to continue this fighting in Syria is actually a tragedy. We need to all get behind the Geneva Convention process, the Geneva process, and come to a diplomatic solution.
So, are Iranian forces being emboldened to continue testing Israel's resolve in Syria? And will an increasingly concerned Israeli government be further drawn into the war next door? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Jerusalem is Yossi Cooperwasser. He is the project director for regional Middle East developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. In Tehran, we have Mohammad Marandi. He is an Iranian studies professor at Tehran University. And in Istanbul, Hadi al-Bahra, former president of the Syrian National Coalition. Thanks all so much for joining us. Let me begin in Tehran. Mohammad, what is happening here? The overarching fear is that Iran and Israel are headed toward war. Is that what it is?
Well, that would be up to the Israeli regime. The attack that happened last night, fortunately, didn't have any Iranian casualties, but unfortunately, I think they did murder a number of Syrian army soldiers. And of course, it's a violation of international law, but of course, the Israeli regime does not understand anything about international law. They have been attacking Syria for a very long time, just as they've been shooting down Palestinian protesters on the border of Gaza. So we have to see how the Israeli regime behaves.
Okay.
But obviously, the Syrian Arab Army will defend its positions, and the Iranians, if they're hit, they will strike back.
Okay, but I remember the Iranian press publicizing the fact that Iranians were killed in the Israeli strike in February. On April 9th, rather, and they vowed retaliation, publicly vowed retaliation. Right. I mean, will Iran have to respond now, or is there a plan to de-escalate, if possible?
Well, what happened last night, again, didn't have anything to do with Iranian troops.
I'm talking about the earlier strike, where Iranians were killed.
Yes. Yes, Iran will definitely respond, and the Israelis, when they murder Iranians, they're going to have to face the consequences.
Okay,
so, yes,
what will those consequences be?
Well, they will suffer militarily, obviously. They've killed Iranian soldiers who were in Syria to fight against the Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates and ISIS and the extremists, the very same extremists that the Israeli regime not only tolerates it on its border, the Israeli regime tolerates ISIS on its border. The former defense minister of Israel said that once they apologized to us when they accidentally lobbed a mortar into Israel, and Al-Qaeda their wounded are being treated by the Israelis. That's something that the former head of Mossad has admitted, and the head of military intelligence in Israel said they don't want ISIS to lose the war.
Right.
So
but
the reason why they attack Iranians and Syrians is because they want to support the extremists.
You're saying Iran has an obligation then to retaliate, and that will be a military retaliation.
Of course,
and Israel will also have to protect its own interests. So are these countries heading to war? Because it's not an Israeli choice as you've said, Iran will make that choice as well.
No, the Israeli regime chose to violate Syrian and Lebanese airspace. They've chose to bomb
right, but that
another
choice
country.
has been made, and we're at what we're at. And the fear is now that these two countries will engage militarily. That equates to war.
In any case, the Israelis cannot continue to act with impunity. The Israelis think that they can just kill whenever they please, like they do in Gaza. They just they practice shooting on Palestinians. That's not going to happen with Iranians. They've already been humiliated by Hezbollah in Lebanon, and it's best for the Israelis to stick within their borders. Otherwise, they're going to face the consequences.
Okay, Yossi Cooper-Wasser, having heard what you've heard, can this be de-escalated?
I sincerely hope so. We in Israel definitely don't have any interest in any escalation. The point is that the Iranians are using their grip over the Assad regime in order to build in Syria the capability to strike against Israel, maybe do more than that in violating all kinds of commitments they have. And as a matter of fact, on February 10th, they already carried out an Iranian operation against Israel with the unmanned air vehicle that they used from T4 that was on its way to carry out a terror attack inside Israel by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. So we have to defend ourselves, and that's what we're doing. And, but we have no interest in escalation. We sincerely hope that the international forces like Russia, like the United States, like the rest of the international community, will convince the Iranians to pull their forces that are in Syria and located there in order to hit Israel. We don't like the Iranian presence there in the first place, but we never did anything against the Iranian presence there that is involved in the inner fighting. What we have to do is to prepare to protect ourselves. And we have no interest in escalation, as I said, on the contrary. I must say to Muhammad that efforts to mention what's happening in Gaza is totally out of line, because what's happening in Gaza is that we see a violent effort to destroy the security fence that we have to defend ourselves. And out of 44 people that lost their lives there, 36 were actually terror activists. The rest we don't know, but on 36 we know that there were terror activists. So let's put the record straight on what's happening here.
Mohammed, I'll let you respond.
Well, obviously there was no drone strike in occupied Palestine. All the Iranian drones are used against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And of course, the Israeli regime supports these groups. So when the Iranian drones are downed inside the areas near the border of the Israeli regime, the Israelis consider it as an attack on their territory because they're supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. With regards to Gaza, I think it's clear as day. The regime soldiers, they've been carrying out target practice on ordinary people. And Iran's presence in Syria has been, from the very beginning, Iran's presence was seriously began in 2015. And that was only after already tens of thousands of foreign fighters had been in the country, brought into the country by foreign actors and intelligence services like the CIA. All your viewers have to do is read the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, the Pentagon Military Intelligence Organization, that said from early on in the Syrian conflict the extremists had the upper hand. They were the important fighting force. And that the United States, later on, the head of that organization, General Michael Flynn, he admitted on Al Jazeera that the United States took a willful decision to support the extremists and its allies in supporting those extremists, which later evolved into ISIS. And of course, there were Al-Qaeda groups like the Nusra from the beginning. So Iran was there to fight the extremists. The drones are there to fight the extremists. The Israeli regime knows that, and they murdered Iranians, and now they're going to have to face the consequences.
You say they're going to have to face those consequences, but if Iran goes up against Israel in Syria, or anywhere else for that matter, militarily, Israel will have the support of the United States. Is Tehran ready for that?
Iran's response to the Israeli regime will come. And where Iran will strike, when will it strike, that is for the Iranians to decide. But the Iranians are not concerned about the United States.
Okay.
The Israeli regime carried out aggression. They violated international law. They murdered Iranian soldiers. And they're going to face the consequences. It's as simple as that. Iran is not Saudi Arabia, some client regime of the United States. The Iranian government is responsible for protecting its people, and the Iranian soldiers were in Syria to fight against the extremists that the United States and the Israelis have been supporting ever since the beginning of the conflict. And the Israelis carried out an unprovoked attack, and as I said, they're going to have to pay the price.
Okay, let me bring in Hadi al-Bahra and ask what your perspective on this is as a member of the Syrian opposition. I mean, is this a case now of the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Do you support Israeli military action on Syrian territory to fight Iranian militia and forces?
No, for us as Syrians, this is the most horrible situation we are in. Our hearts turn apart by seeing our land with this bloodbath going everywhere. For Iran, as I hear that he is a legitimate presence in Syria and he's fighting Al-Qaeda, which is completely untrue. The Iranian forces and the brought-in foreign militias actually assisting the Assad regime in committing war crimes against civilians. More than 500,000 innocent people have fallen, most of them women and children. What fault they brought to be punished this way? The existence of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard inside Syria, fighting on our soil. If Iran wants to protect its land or to challenge Israel, it has to do it from its own border, not on our land. We are not a playground for forces to fight against each other over in our land and let our innocent people pay the price of it. The presence of Iran is illegitimate in Syria. It's a practice.
May I respond?
It did commit war crimes against civilians in Syria. And it's the only foreign power also which is not pushing for a political resolution of the crisis and assisting the regime in its war effort against its own people.
Yes, Mohammed, go ahead.
Well, what your guest in Istanbul is saying runs against evidence provided by that has been revealed that belongs to the American government. According to WikiLeaks, Hillary Clinton admitted that in 2014 Saudi Arabia was supporting ISIS. We also have the leaked audio tape of former Secretary of State Kerry, where he admitted to Syrian opposition figures, as they say, that the United States allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus to put pressure on the country. These are things that are out there online for people to look at. And Iran, as I said, is in Syria to defend the country against the extremists. And these extremists, we all know who these extremists are. We know from the documentation, from their actions, Al-Qaeda, the Nusra Front was a branch of Al-Qaeda. ISIS, before it was ISIS, it was a branch of Al-Qaeda. We know where their funding came from. We know which intelligence organizations brought them into Syria. So I think one should not be naive in the way one presents this, and Iran will not act in any way inside Syria without the consent of the Syrian government. Iran's response to the Israeli regime will come, but no one knows when, and no one knows from where.
Let me turn back to Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Post, in a piece they wrote recently, said, for Israel, the next chapter in Syria will be a nightmare. The next chapter in Syria's war for Israel will be a nightmare scenario. Do you think that is the case? And I'd like you as well to comment on the exchange you heard if you did indeed hear it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to, again, our friend from Tehran, Mohammed, can say whatever he wants because the audio is very receptive to anything. But the UAV that, or the drones, you call it, that we have managed to prevent from entering and causing damage in Israel was not over Syrian territory. It was crossing Jordan and then turned westwards towards Israel. So let's again come back to the facts. And the Iranian presence in Syria is not only against extremists, but also against the Syrian people. And the fact is that the Iranians are cooperating with Assad that used chemical weapons against his own people. And as Hadi said, killed 500,000 people from his own people. That's unbelievable, but this is what's happening.
Okay,
now,
it is what's happening.
We should remember that and remember who's doing the good things here and who's doing the bad things. What we are doing, for example, in this respect, we are trying very much to help the Syrian population by our humanitarian aid and by our medical aid. That's what we are trying to do, and to prevent even harsher results from what the Iranians are doing.
Okay, but we have to look forward.
Coming back to what you said about what you asked about the future.
Yes, go ahead. That's what we're talking about.
I am less pessimistic. I think that what the new development that we are now seeing is that the international community, led by the United States, is ready to take steps in order to say that there are some rules of the game that should be kept in the Syrian war. And as long as this is going to be the case,
but Yossi, very
there
quickly,
is hope that eventually...
As I asked Mohammed, if Tehran should fear the alliance between Israel and the United States if it takes military action, should Israel fear the reaction of Iran and its Russian allies, as well as Syria, in this war?
We don't think that Russia is an ally of Iran in this war. We believe that Russia can play a positive role in clarifying to Iran that they should not use Syria's territory in order to carry out terror attacks and other activities against Israel. If the Russians do that, they can be very helpful in de-escalating the situation. And that's our expectations from Russia.
Okay, Yossi, unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you the final word because we are completely out of time for this segment. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us. In the UK, a key ally of Prime Minister Theresa May has resigned after revealing she inadvertently misled her government over the deportation targets of illegal immigrants. Home Secretary Amber Rudd's resignation, combined with the fallout from the Windrush generation scandal, has left the government struggling to combat accusations of institutional racism. At the height of the Windrush generation controversy, I spoke to one of the descendants of a Caribbean migrant. Here's my conversation with journalist Richard Sudan, who described how his grandfather would have reacted to the government's policies today.
Well, he would be angry because, first of all, as you say, he was part of this Windrush generation. Now, in addition to the current scandal over the Windrush generation, that's to say people that came here in the 40s, 50s and 60s at the invitation of Britain, it's one thing that they are being treated like rubbish by the British state, but the reason he would be appalled at the treatment of migrants is because of the treatment of migrants generally, the so-called refugee crisis following wars of imperialism. So he would actually be angry on a number of fronts, a number of levels, but he would be particularly aghast at the treatment of his fellow Caribbean citizens, because it's quite one thing when the European powers went to the Caribbean and took resources and colonized our countries for so long. But then when they invited our people to come to England, like my grandfather, to help boost the labour force, to then, 4 or 5 decades later, because of rising right-wing sentiment in this country, in the UK, because of this, they are now being asked to prove their status when they came to England and London as citizens of Britain. It's absolutely unbelievable. It represents a national disgrace, and I'm going to go one further. It's not enough to have the empty words and apologies
The empty words and apology. I was just about to ask you that. I mean, Theresa May's apology is obviously not enough, but the government also says in its defense, some members of the government, that this was more of an unintended bureaucratic failure, not any sort of deliberate racist policy. You don't agree with that?
No, I do not agree with that, because I cannot imagine a scenario whereby other immigrants, for example, expats as they're known, other, British immigrants to other countries, had they returned to the UK, we all know they wouldn't be treated in this way. And actually, if you look at the way UK policy works, actually African Caribbeans and people from the Caribbean communities are often left in some of the most deprived communities. So the treatment of the Windrush generation has to be seen in a wider context of racism at the hands of the British state. And I think more and more, actually, this is how people are starting to frame this issue.
Okay, well, I'm going to speak on behalf of the Home Office and just, to play devil's advocate here, because they say that in deciding immigration cases, which they felt the Windrush generation actually was, they consider alternative documents, including tax records, utility bills in some cases, and that those are relatively simple to produce. So what's the problem here? If you can't come up with those landing cards to prove when you initially immigrated, why would it be so hard to come up with bills, school records, or anything else?
Well, I think we have to look at this sometimes on a case-by-case basis and remember the humanity of the people we're dealing with. There are lots of complex and nuanced reasons why the sudden demand for documentation presents a number of difficulties. Many of these people, of course, have been here for a long time, and of course, records, documents, these things get lost. And so I think it's quite an assumption for the Home Office as it revamps and cuts corners within its departments, to all of a sudden, we have to remember 40 or 50 or 60 years later to demand documentation when, by the way, the parents of the Windrush generation, they had British passports, and a lot of their children travelled, for example, on their parents' passports. And of course, not everyone necessarily always applies for a passport immediately. So the question isn't really for me about the efficiency or the management of the Windrush generation, about how they manage their documents, and it's really about the efficiency and how the Home Office and how the British government is run and how they organise themselves, not the other way around.
Okay. On the Home Office, Theresa May was in charge of the Home Office that essentially destroyed those landing cards we talked about. She's issued an apology you don't find sincere, necessarily. Do you think she is ultimately responsible for this debacle?
I think she and her government are ultimately responsible. Theresa May is the Prime Minister now. She was in charge of obviously in charge of the campaigns people will remember, like the Go Home vans a couple of years back, which targeted immigrants when she was in the Home Office. So to answer the first part of your question, I don't think anybody who's been keeping an eye on this issue regards her apologies or her admissions as very sincere. And when people get caught doing wrong, it's hard to take their apology as sincere, because they've gotten caught in the act. So it's not she's not personally responsible, but she's absolutely maintaining a legacy of her government and her predecessors. And in terms of their view of immigrants, particularly from the Caribbean and elsewhere, anyone can check the history books. The Conservative government have always been arguably at the head of racist policies.
Okay, let me ask, ultimately, if you're optimistic that this can be reconciled, because it's not the first time that things like this have happened. It was only 12 years ago that the Britons changed their laws on inheriting nationality. Up until 12 years ago, it was only able to come through a man. Women and mothers did not count. You could only inherit British nationality through a father. They've corrected that. Do you think it's just a matter of time before this situation can be rightfully corrected? Or are you a lot more pessimistic than that?
I'm a bit more, cynical. I'm old enough to remember promises like these being made again. And my fear, actually, my concern, is that right now, this is a political football. The question of how Caribbean immigrants are being treated in this country. Right now, it's newsworthy because of the whole Windrush story. But my fear, actually, is that these promises we're hearing right now from the government, from the Home Office, and we're only hearing these promises because they've been they've had cases put to them, like the case of Albert Thompson, denied his medical treatment, other cases of people losing employment. We will see what their actions are down the line, but right now there's not much to suggest they're doing anything beyond trying to deflect, trying to obfuscate, trying to diminish their own responsibility in this issue.
Okay, Richard Sudan, unfortunately we're out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us from London. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Remember, you can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, out with the old. Armenia is about to appoint a new prime minister after weeks of unrest. So was the revolution a success? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.